Well, it's great to have Stefan here. I actually met Stefan a few years ago when he made his first trip to New Zealand as a guest of the World of Wearable Arts, and I was just blown away by what you've achieved with Not Just a Label. I don't know if many of you know much about Not Just a Label, but it's a global online platform for emerging designers and new talent. It's turned the traditional fashion model on its head, and currently you have more than 20,000, you represent 20,000 designers in 150 countries, which is pretty phenomenal. Stefan also speaks English, Italian, Spanish, German. He travels a lot, lives in London, and everyone's asking him, are you tired? But you're not tired, are you just used to travelling?
No, I think you get used to it, yeah.
So I thought before the loose topic of today was around the future of fashion, and I thought before we got onto that Stefan you could explain a bit about how you used to work in finance, then you're a fashion model, and then how did you come up with the idea for Not Just a Label, and how did you make that happen?
I think, I don't know, I get bored really quickly, and if I gave you sort of my CV, you would see that I've done so many different jobs, and I think, it's about doing as many things as you can to find out what you really want to do, and including a lot of activities and jobs that perhaps you already know that you don't want to be in, and they will not be sort of fulfilling, or you will be doing those jobs for the rest of your life. And banking for me was, I call it a cultural safari in some way, and it was probably the best school I ever had, because during my studies I worked on the modeling side, I worked in music and PR, I did all kinds of jobs, but I think finance definitely, if you're able to sort of see it as a sort of learning curve and as a school, then it's a fantastic experience. And also in terms of the type of finance I was in investment banking, but on the fashion or consumer retail side, so working already with fashion brands and seeing how bigger brands would invest in emerging designers.
That's great. So one of the unique things I love about Not Just a Label is how it's providing a connection point for both designers and consumers in faraway places. So you've got designers in 150 different countries. So if you're a creative, you don't have to be living in a fashion hub like Milan, New York, Paris, London. You can actually still have a voice. Can you tell us a bit about that model and the website?
Yeah, I think we live in times of a sort of almost global gentrification in terms of other cities becoming, or let's say, I think creative ecosystems are being created, or sort of are happening all around the world, and obviously the digital age and the internet has changed a lot for all of us, and therefore back in the day you had to be in Milan or in Paris, because in terms of the suppliers, in terms of the machinery, the fashion system, it used to be all there. I think what happens now is that these cities at the same time are very costly in terms of, what does it cost you personally, but also your business to be in those cities. And I think people are becoming more pragmatic in terms of saying, what do I get out of it? And even for us as a company, the question about where to be located is always a very timely one.
So have you got stories about, I know when I first met you, you had a designer in Africa who was recognised and picked up and had an opportunity globally through people seeing her work on the website. Have you got some examples of people that are sort of in remote locations sort of doing great things?
Yeah, we have, so as soon as you designers create a profile on our website and are accepted, you end up on this global directory, and we have about 600 requests going from the general public to designers. So imagine 600 business inquiries going to young talent all around the world, and it really ranges from students wanting to see if they can intern for one of the designers to we have celebrities like Beyonce picking her clothes for the tour, and she does it herself. So these success stories keep on happening every day, and it really goes from headhunting. I know one of my colleagues was in Switzerland for a graduate show that we live streamed on our website the other weekend, and she was saying 2 or 3 of the graduates said from the moment they had a profile on the website, so within a week, they already found a job. So Acne, for example, hired a few people right away. So these opportunities are now able to be created through platforms like ours, but also other platforms, but mostly because we're using the internet in the right way.
So going back to the original idea, you and your brother were sitting in a bar having a discussion about the business. How did the actual concept come to be?
Yeah, there was no bar involved.
No bar? No. It was a restaurant.
My brother was definitely too young for that, but it was mostly because, me working, it was one job I had at Merrill Lynch, and that was to find emerging talent for bigger luxury conglomerates to invest in. And I remember I had the annual report of the Gucci Group in front of me. Gucci Group is now called Kering, but they acquired Alexander McQueen, Stella McCartney, and Bottega Veneta through the bank I was working with. And you went through the annual report, which usually is sort of a 300-400 page document, and the last section said emerging designers, and those 3 brands were in there. And they all had a turnover between 13 and 16 million euros back then. And I thought, there must be more emerging designers than that. And it surely must be cheaper to invest in designers who have started their brand much earlier. And then I started looking into the McQueen story and realized that, going back to Isabella Blow, who in some way was his first investor, she came up to him after the graduate show and said, you can have £5,000, but I'm going to give it to you in installments, £500 every month, and with that you get your first studio and you start creating your first collection. That's how she bought the first collection from him. So I thought she probably had the biggest impact, not because it's Isabella Blow, but more because, in terms of a financial investor, she was there at the right time. And by studying designers from graduation to when they sort of appear on the radar of bigger brands or the fashion landscape, you can see that they all need the same support, and that is usually a very transparent system of showcasing. They need a very transparent but genuine support, and generally perhaps the first sales channels as well, so that they can sell the first pieces in a direct way, so that the money that comes in is reinvested in the business. And based on those parameters, I then had the idea of bringing designers together on an online platform. And back then, when I researched these designers, they were all using, you might remember a website called MySpace. That's what most designers back in the days were using, and it was highly unprofessional. It wasn't loading. I think they spent too much time picking the song that you sort of link to your MySpace profile, but it wasn't really sort of what could be used on a professional basis. And and then having a brother who basically was a geek, looking at the metrics and the black screen every day and coding websites, that was definitely a Sunday afternoon where I said, hey, I've got a good idea, let me quit my job and start that. And I think, how many times all of you probably had an idea on a Sunday afternoon and you said, I want to open that restaurant, or, I had an idea for a gallery, I had an idea for something else. And I just walked into the office on Monday and quit. And so that for me was just sort of coming back to your question about finance. For me, I knew that I need to get out of it as soon as I learned, until sort of that train took me in some way to where I had to get to. And then 2 weeks later, the Lehman Brothers, which is the competitor, crashed, and then the financial crisis started. So that was a good sign that I was doing the right thing.
Fantastic. So there's definitely been a lot of shake-up and change in the industry in recent times, and on many, many levels, and Not Just a Label is definitely, one of those change makers. And I suppose, from a fashion audience here in particular, interested in the movements, there are designers like Victor and Rolf and Jean-Paul Gaultier who, a couple of years ago said, hey, we don't want to do ready-to-wear anymore, we want to just do haute couture. And Raf Simons has recently left Dior, and Albert Vaz from Lanvin, he's gone. And a lot of people are talking about sort of that I've sort of been really overworked and the treadmill of fashion and ready to wear. And I just sort of wondered with you being in the business of fashion and sort of doing it from a different side, how you were viewing this traditional model and how it's kind of breaking down at the moment, it seems. I'm
always surprised that people still don't understand how fashion really works, and what it takes to actually sell collections on that level, and how hard of a business it is, and therefore I think finally in some way there's some sort of transparency and perhaps pragmatism coming into fashion, and even for those big designers, I think joining a big fashion brand means that unfortunately we all love this romantic vision of Albert Elbaz designing the collection, and it doesn't happen because those brands are merchandiser driven. That means the buyers and the merchandisers in certain markets feed back to the head office and say, in this market we can sell a lot of handbags and they look exactly like that. They have these materials, that's the price point, that's how much you have per bag in terms of spending on materials and supplies. And obviously the creativity becomes something that is almost non-existent anymore. And I'm not sure if they are naive or if we as a general audience are naive, but that's just how it works. And I think even more in a sort of even more drastically is sort of if you look at business models like Zara, that perhaps is probably at the moment the smartest business model out there. We need to understand that fashion is going either that way or it is going into the direction of pure art again, and there's a huge demand for that. It's just that we need to decide on which side we want to be on.
So what side would Not Just a Label be on? Would that be, I would say, the more authentic side, because your designers are, what consumers are looking for now is authenticity and design. I guess it's either fast fashion, cheap, or they want something.
Yeah, I think at the moment it's really about sort of deciding. There's a huge demand for individuality, and we've seen this in other industries, like in food. I think nobody of us here, or perhaps I don't know if that has reached New Zealand, but I'm sure it is coming. And in the food industry, people now are looking really for the regional kitchen again. They want to know what they're eating, what they're consuming, and the same thing with hospitality, where big hotel chains like Hilton or Sheraton, they're all coming up with their own boutique sub-brands because they realize that people want to have an experience again. And I think fashion is unfortunately always a bit slow in sort of picking up these things. But we see it on our website. There's a huge demand for individuality, for owning pieces that you can keep for longer. Unfortunately, on average, especially in the UK, people wear items 4 times before they throw them away again. So we can't really talk about purchasing fashion. Is more consumption of fashion and a throwaway generation as well. But I'm saying, I think there's a huge demand, and hopefully these great talented superstar designers will in some way find a way to create very artistic collections. And I think if the fashion houses are smart, they will then in some way have a couture-led fashion house that on top has a couture collection that is there if you want to purchase it. And then the rest of the house can be inspired by that, but it would be merchandiser driven.
I do love the idea with many of your designers where people can actually go online, and if they love a coat, they can order it, and then it says this coat will be take 10 days to make, and then we'll ship it to you. So it's made on demand, so it's not like a lot of stock just sitting around, and that's quite a lovely way of not creating a lot of waste and stuff. I guess the industry's model has also been challenged right now with consumers demanding greater transparency in terms of how the clothing is made. There was the Rana factory collapse in Bangladesh in 2013 that killed a few thousand workers, many of them child workers, and people working for below living wages. So that's really shaken up the industry. So I guess people are not just demanding that they've got artisan clothing or care, but that people are actually paid enough money and they're asking questions. And I know there are positive initiatives out there at the moment, like child labour free, like NOMD in Dunedin very proudly is the first child labour free manufacturing accredited label in the world so far. It's a New Zealand initiative. Kate Sylvester and Howard have just also become accredited. And I guess, do your observations on this trend, are you seeing more people asking those questions like, where was this made, who made this, what's it made of?
I think we live in times of huge distrust, or sort of people not trusting, or people wanting to know what they consume and what they purchase. And does fashion provide information? No, and I think at the moment it's still too complicated, even for us to in some way certify or in some way categorize what sustainable fashion actually means. And the truth of it all is sustainable and fashion are two words that don't go together. It's an oxymoron, if you haven't realized. So I'm quite sick of talking about sustainable fashion, but at the same time, I think sustainable fashion, or a sort of more ethical approach to fashion, has to be divided in so many different categories. And we talk about, of course, the ethical labor conditions, which in some way for emerging designers is still something they can control, because they can choose who to work with or where to get their supplies from. But I think it becomes much more complicated when it goes into the materials, because you can support organic cotton, but then how do you stitch the organic cotton together, or how do you dye those fabrics? And then of course the whole supply chain is in some way very intransparent as well. Even the biggest companies, on one side of course they say it is hard to sort of really research where does the supply chain start and end. Another way, they perhaps want it to be in some way quite nebulous, or in some way, hard to sort of trace. But then another really important aspect in sort of sustainable fashion is fabric care as well. So what do you do after the purchase? What can you do to in some way lengthen or how can you sort of extend this timeline or the life of a garment that you buy? And I'm sure all of us in some way inherited something from our parents or grandfather, grandmother, and that's almost sort of how do we go back to that? And I think if you invest into a piece of clothing, then you have a different approach to fashion. So it's not only about providing products that are sustainably made, but I think it's also about creating things that are sustainable because they are better, because they serve a purpose. And that's a responsibility that we have to give back to the designers, Let's start making pieces that we can actually use and keep on reusing, and not just sort of, live on this sort of trend that we need, 4 seasons, 8 seasons, 12 seasons a year.
So not just Label started as a online platform, but recently you've actually created a physical store in New York, and you also did something in Dubai. Can you tell us a bit about that?
I think the coming together of offline and online, I think, is something that is vital at the moment. The biggest problem, or let's say perhaps 4 or 5 years ago, the reason why online shopping was doing so well is because offline or the physical shops were doing so badly because they didn't have a strategy, and therefore you had so many shops closing, because what they were doing is, you probably know by walking down a high street, they were not doing anything different to the other store just sitting next to them. So it was basically just putting racks of clothing in there. You could just pick up something, and the next day you went back and picked up something else, and that is not enough. So we live in this sort of world of perhaps a more enlightened and more informed consumer or customer, and therefore online shopping just seemed more interesting, or let's say more convenient. And I think the biggest reason why people shop online, or perhaps have shopped online in the last couple of years, was convenience. So why would I move away from my couch if I can order something that is delivered to my door the next couple of days, so that I can avoid going into those stores, because it's a waste of time. Look at, for example, supermarkets in London or in Europe. Almost every supermarket chain now delivers home. And you really start questioning what I'm doing with my 24 hours that I've got in there. Why do I have to basically, and there's some really interesting research about why would you have to go into a store that you don't like, B, you're actually running around between aisles, picking things up and then transporting them to a cashier if somebody else can do that. So the cost that you have in terms of time is much higher than home delivery could be. And the same thing is happening for restaurants. I don't know if you heard about apps called Deliveroo or Seamless in New York. So what they're doing is they're saying restaurants are getting boring, so why don't we create an army of people who literally just transport food from any restaurant in your surrounding to your home. And the other night I had friends at my place, and we were able to order from different restaurants, and they all came at the same time, and we had this dinner. And then at some point someone was like, well, why would you even go to restaurants anymore? Because you have to book in advance, you have to queue up, you have the whole stress on a Friday night to actually going to those restaurants. And the reason of that is because we have stopped creating experiences for people. And now coming back to your question, I think what we need to do is create experiences online but also offline. And that is why we opened 3 stores last year, that this year we'll move into permanent stores. And with all these stores, we in some way turned the retail model upside down. We were invited by cities or governments to open our stores. So the production, the fit out and also the rent were covered by the partners that we work with. By that we were able to enter a space that didn't have a pressure in terms of selling. So once you stop paying rent, you can basically do whatever you want, because you can say, if I sell 1 dress today or 100 dresses, it doesn't really matter in terms of my risk. And that's what we did in Dubai. We opened a 1,200 square meter store and we almost pushed retail into the far corner. And we had concerts every night. We had workshops like these for 200 people a day. We had 3D printing, we had community gatherings, and all of that made shopping much, much more, in some way, inclusive. And the same thing happened in Berlin, and then in New York we did the same. In New York we opened our store in a location that cost $500,000 a month to rent, which is on Park Avenue in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. And the hotel preferred to give us the location to us because they had interest from Chanel and Hermes to move in, and they said, you can have the space. And we were there for a few weeks and we generated a PR value for the hotel of $6.9 million, just because we came with something completely different. We were able, in New York, we had a selection of 150 designers selling pieces that were made in New York City. In Dubai, we had 50% of our designers coming from the Middle East and 50% were from all over the world. So we had about 400 designers represented in one store. And in all stores, again, by not having to pay our rent or not having to have these huge overheads. In New York, we gave 90% of the retail price to our designers. In Dubai, we gave 50% of the retail price to our designers. So suddenly you see all these designers making a lot of money, and especially the best feedback were the customers who came in New York and they said, we walk into Saks, which was basically next door. We had Gucci, Prada, Louis Vuitton, all of those stores next to us, and they were saying, we're bored of walking into those stores, and I didn't even know that these young designers existed. So the learning curve for us in terms of creative people, also for designers, is that your customer doesn't even know that you're out there because they're really busy. They're much older than you think, so they're not 19, and they also don't have a size 0. And on average in our store they spend $600 per purchase. So again, this is your customer because your garments are unfortunately very expensive. And I think this was the biggest takeaway, so that the luxury customer really seeks emerging design, but they will not travel across town to go and find you in the little underground shop that has become a destination. So you need to go to them.
So you will pop up there, but now you're looking at doing a permanent store in New York.
Yeah, because we realized that with the turnover that we were making, that we could also pay rent, but more property developers have started coming to us, and they said, if you can turn your business model around, we can do the same. So I'm going to be in LA next week looking at 3 locations, and those developers are saying, we're going to give you the location for free because we know that you're attracting such a huge crowd and such an interesting concept that our rents and the value of the building will go up just by having you there. So again, that is how easy sometimes you can take business models and just flip them around.
And that also, a lot of businesses have taken notice, like I know that a lot of, big brands come to you. Is it like with the Ferrari one and Vivienne Westwood, where they're established brands, but they see what you're doing and they're like, we want to be part of that, so how can we be part of that? So you've done some interesting collaborations, haven't you? Yeah, so we really have become sort of the gatekeeper of the creative community, and we work with, you can't hear?
Can you flip your microphone?
Oh yeah, it fell down, thank you.
Thanks.
Is this better? So we work with huge corporations and also governments on a few really interesting projects, and usually they include our designers. And one of our first projects ever was based on basically a story that we heard that was invited to a dinner party in Italy, and and on the table there were a few of these big Italian CEOs of fashion houses, and they were saying we're losing a lot of manufacturing techniques in northern Italy due to the younger generations not wanting to work in manufacturing, the sort of family-owned businesses closing down, and the saddest story, and I think that was sort of a bit of the let's call it sort of the motivation of creating this business department for ourselves was the curator of the Art Biennale in Venice. He was sitting there and he said he was trying to support an American artist who wanted to create an installation based on old bicycle saddles, and one of the oldest bicycle factory in the world is based in Vicenza outside of Venice, and the artist had tried to sort of get in touch with the company on recreating those old saddles that basically were nothing more than perforated leather, but it's quite an intrinsic process to create them. And the artist gave up because he apparently called and emailed so many times, and finally the curator said, come to Venice and we'll drive there together and we'll ask the CEO who I know. And then unfortunately the CEO said that the last guy who knew how to create these saddles passed away a year ago, and this technique had never been passed on because by now the only thing they create is carbon fiber saddles and super sort of high technology products, and I think that was a bit of a sort of an alarm for a lot of entrepreneurs in the area, and they said, is there a way that we can in some way bring your creativity in terms of the network that you have to Italy and have these manufacturers engage with your designers? And so we went back to London and we came back with quite a bold offering. We said every year we want to have the budget to fly 100 of our best designers to Italy, pay their flights, pay their hotels, and then pair them with those manufacturers and see what comes out of it. And we didn't hear anything for 8 months, and then they came back and said, yes, we found 55 million euros and let's make it happen. And they built Italy's biggest trade show pavilion in Vicenza, which is the heart of fashion luxury manufacturing in Europe. And since then we fly 100 designers every year, and I think, you all know Margie from Nondi and Mark from the Stolen Girlfriend Club. I think they came with us the first season, so this year we're actually moving into Milan because it will become even bigger. And based on that, we then realized that we can actually work with the biggest governments or institutions or corporations around the world in creating really interesting collaborations by pairing the youngest in the industry with the most established ones. And we're just about to launch a project with Electrolux on washing machines, out of all things. It's really interesting what is happening in that sector because they're actually launching the first washing machine that will not use water in the drying process, and also they want to in some way educate people on stop washing at such high degrees. Apparently you can wash everything cold these days and it has the same effect as washing things at 90 degrees. And there are studies on how do we make sure that designers start putting the right fabric care symbols inside their garments. And that is a huge thing. And apparently, I don't know how many young designers are in here, but I would estimate 90% of you put dry clean only tags in there. Because you're saying no, but I can tell you 90% of designers do that because they don't even know how to take care of their own fabric, and that is something that we want to start doing. So allowing designers to work with these big brands.
That's really amazing. So in terms of selection with designers, you talk about you choose 100 designers from not just a label every year to attend this event. So you've got 20,000 on your book. So how does the selection process work?
Most of our selection processes are quite specific, and therefore our database at the moment, I would almost say it's too small still to sort of being able to cater to some of the requests we get. For example, with AEG or Electrolux, we had quite a specific brief in terms of the materials that these designers use in the country they live in. So, if you break it down and we want a designer who uses sustainable fabrics, perhaps wool, and lives in Iceland and creates women's wear, then you will see that huge database shrinks down to 20 designers. And that's how we see it. So of course there's a huge influx of, we have about 200 new designers joining every month, but that doesn't mean we look at 20,000 designers every time we do a selection process.
Yeah, that would be a bit of a headache. So I know there are a lot of budding designers and established designers in the room today. What advice would you give them in terms of if they were wanting to be interested in putting their collections forward or themselves forward to become part of not just a label?
Well, it's quite easy. So you basically just send us your lookbooks, or you can do it online as well. You can create your profile. It then is hidden from the directory, and then it gets approved by the team. Or you just email us your lookbooks, and then you got a team basically getting back to you. The email address for that is scouting@notjustalabel.com, or you just do it online. So either way works.
Great. So you did have some New Zealand labels initially on the box. I had a little Google the other day and I couldn't find them quickly. So do you still have any New Zealand labels on?
Yeah, there's about 60 of them,
yeah?
I was told.
Oh, I obviously did a bad Google. My search was obviously flawed. Great. Okay, so in terms of the when you are on the, there's obligation as a designer on the site. As a designer being on the site, you've got responsibilities to also adhere to. So what, from a designer's point of view, what do they have to do once they're with you guys?
I mean, it really comes down to the designers, and that is always the advice we give to designers. You can be as successful as you want, but you have to be you have to be on top of things, and your online presence, not only on our website, is one of the most important things, because unfortunately fashion by now is valued, or sort of is judged not only based on your collections and your amazing work, that unfortunately you're the only person who sees that, but in the online world, your picture and whatever you represent through, unfortunately, a two-dimensional JPEG of a few thousand pixels, that's the only brand representation you get. So the more you update your profiles, the more you update, especially on our website, the more you update the products that go on our online shop. It's similar to having your own store. Sometimes you hang pieces into the window, they go back, you keep on refreshing, and that is what the best designers on our platform do. So they're on top of things, and they inform us if there's any news, they send us images, if there are any celebrities wearing their items, so we can use them as well for social media. And these are usually the designers that, in some way have, or accept that, marketing is part of a business.
I noticed video is a big part of marketing on your site too. A lot of designers do their own video.
Yeah, I think fashion film, as we call it, has become a huge marketing tool that in some way is not very expensive, because almost everyone can create a video with their iPhone by now. But in some cases, even it can replace a fashion show, because videos can be seen by as many people as you like, and they get shared, they get sent around. I know designers who had close to 1 million views on YouTube on their videos, and you compare that to a fashion show where you have 300-400 people coming in, and then the expense of a fashion show compared to creating a video like that. So I don't think video is the solution to everything, and there will be something else coming very soon. But it is definitely important to have both the still and the moving image.
That reminds me of the traditional fashion show concept at the moment too, where you show on clothing on the fashion catwalk, Fashion Week, and then 6 months later it's traditionally put out. I know some designers are now doing a pre-sale where they're getting buyers to sign confidentiality agreements and then releasing their clothes onto the market 8 weeks later, because the consumers are, because they see it now, they can see everything online. They don't want to wait 6 months for those designs. Plus, the high street's going to rip off those designs really quickly anyway. So, in a way, that's, I suppose the industry has changed. Do you think that the Fashion Week model is still relevant in terms of how it's running, or?
I think if we look at fashion weeks in the global fashion context, then I think we need to stop working on the whole system. That at the moment doesn't make sense, because of course fashion weeks or fashion shows alone, they will always be there, because it's fantastic to go to a show, and if you've ever been to Paris and you go to those shows, it is in some way overwhelming what you see, but at the same time, let's face it, these shows cost close to 300,000-500,000 euros per show, and it's over after half an hour. I think for a young designer, what you need to in some way understand is what are you getting out of a show. Unfortunately, too many designers jump at the offer to have a fashion show, but then don't understand what is actually coming out of that. And sometimes, in a whole fashion show, there's perhaps one person that is there that can do something, the one editor that will write about you, the one buyer that will change, your business turnover. And sometimes there's better ways to, in some way, engage with these people. In sort of on a holistic basis, the whole system doesn't make sense because, unfortunately, we in some way destroyed it ourselves by having the internet, and therefore we live in a world where the attention span of people is that of a small bird by now, and we want to see things and we get sick by the end of the day, and of course waiting for garments for 6 or 7 months doesn't make sense, and therefore brands have to find a way to retail these collections faster. But then it doesn't mean that we have to now create 12 collections a year, but perhaps we have one collection a year where we add pieces every time, or we create pieces that are, again, coming back to that concept of having pieces that in some way can survive more than a season, have a relevance of a few years. There's so many things that, in some way can be changed, and there are no rules at the moment. So I think the advantage at the moment is, on one side, for the emerging talent to do things, you can do whatever you want, and it's just important that it works for you. And on the other side, I think the big brands as in the luxury houses, they need to make a decision, do they compete with the high street, or do they compete with you basically and become more artistic? But it's similar to the publishing world, either you slow down and create collectibles and you create something of substance that you issue perhaps 6 times a year, 4 times a year, but people keep that and don't throw the magazines away, or you go online, but being stuck in between, that is complicated. And I think there will be less and less people having an understanding for wanting to feed the system, because unfortunately, let's face it, trade show organizers, showrooms, PR agencies, model agencies, there's a whole system out there that only survives because you guys believe in it, and the second you pull the plug and say we don't need fashion weeks anymore, and I know I'm saying this in the context of a fashion week, but even for fashion weeks themselves, and I think, for example, here in Dunedin, it's fantastic that it's open to the general public. That is, for example, one of the first steps that you can make. Let's make fashion more inclusive rather than exclusive.
I think that's the key, this event in particular, because it is open, so what you see on the catwalk you can buy immediately. You don't have to wait 6 months, and I think that's where a lot of fashion weeks are going. In the old days used to be really sort of closed off to just the buyers and media, and it was a really exclusive club, but now you have designers putting consumers in the front row, and it's definitely changing. The consumers are definitely getting more power, which is great. So I'll just ask one more question, because I realise we're running out of time soon, and I know there'll be questions out there in the audience. Stefan, you were saying, what advice would you give, young designers in Dunedin? You saw a lot of creative people. You were helping judge the Emerging Designer Awards yesterday. And people are starting out in this, what advice can you give them?
God, I would have to write a book now. And I think the most important part is always that what designers create in some way needs to tell a story, and that is how we in some way are able to choose designers for our platform. And by story I mean something that links them to a background or a story or part of their life that then creates something unique. And I think what the world does not need is more fashion designers. That's unfortunately the reality. But what we need in this world is designers who create something different that in some way supports their regional environment and their creative economy. Just to make an example, for example, a designer who could be based in Dunedin, if that designer uses a certain type of fabric or a manufacturing technique that comes from this area, then automatically that designer will never be copied, because that designer can't be replicated because it comes from here. It is so unique, and automatically that becomes a very powerful weapon as soon as designers join a platform like ours. And these are always the designers that do the best. We have, and this is unfortunately the frustrating thing for some designers that we have from Paris and London, that if we look at who makes the most amount of money on our website, it's always designers from Morocco, from Lebanon, from Ukraine, from places that are very, in some way, don't give them financial support, countries where it's very hard to live, and these designers in some way have this hunger to survive, but also to sort of grow, and they are usually very smart in terms of creating a brand out of things that they can find, and I think automatically with that they create brands that have an immense power, not only on a sort of retail side but also on a PR side. These are the stories that editors want to write about, because we're sick of the same old Rick Owens copy or the same old Celine copy. And trust me, young designers copy as much as the big brands copy, but everyone is inspired by something. But if your inspiration is on the peninsula out there in Dunedin, then that automatically becomes something that nobody else has. And that's why sometimes I feel like it is better if designers remain where they are and don't make this move of moving into the big fashion capitals, because sometimes the designers then lose this sort of inspiration and integrity.
Oh, so no one needs to move from Dunedin. Okay, are there any questions out in the audience? Do you want to ask any questions? Yes.
What do you think are some emerging fashion capitals in the world now? So you said something about Morocco before.
Yeah, so the question was about emerging fashion capitals. I mean, there's one thing that bothers me about, not about your question, but about the fact that a lot of editors, there was a feature in the British Vogue recently, and they said it's all about Ukraine now. And then we realized in our office that we've been going to Ukraine since 4 years, and we knew Ukraine is a country the size of the UK and Germany perhaps put together, and automatically that means there must be creative people in that country. So it's more that the Western world has ignored that country for so long. So emerging creative capitals don't exist because there are creatives all around the world. It's more us finally opening our eyes and saying, Chile could be an emerging fashion capital. It's this sort of, unfortunately, arrogance in fashion where we always focused on these 4 cities, and perhaps we've, for a few seasons allowed Copenhagen to be interesting. But in terms of the amount of sort of designers coming from certain countries, Ukraine impressed us, but again, the reason for that is just because the world hasn't looked at that country for decades, and now suddenly it is interesting, it is in the news, and these designers are making it to these different design competitions as well. They're making it onto our platform. We had, when we fly these designers to Italy, I think about 5 designers have always been from Ukraine. So automatically these designers appear on the radar.
Your comments are interesting to me about online, because I'm of a certain age and a certain shape that online isn't as easy. I want to see the clothing on and see the shaping, because unless you know the designer well or you know your size, they're all different in terms of sizing. So if you're a 14 in one brand, you may not be in another. So I can buy shoes online, but you're more or less saying the same thing, and the more expensive garments are generally not always sold online. They've got that mix. Would that be, it's always been interesting to me that online is not going to go away, but I've always thought it must be a combination of both for many designers.
And then I think, for example, if you live here, you don't perhaps sometimes have access to this, the selection of designers, but also in terms of global brands, and automatically then your online purchase becomes one out of convenience, because you can't step on a plane and go to these shops all the time. I'm not saying online at the moment solves all the problems, but what we do, perhaps through our platform, we allow millions of people now to access emerging designers. And of course there will be the problem of sizing that will always be there, but we're not buying online because it's easier to buy it online because I can get the right size, and even our website has returns, and we have these sort of customers sending pieces back. But at the same time, we have customers in 188 countries, and that means so many people now have access to emerging design, and there aren't any great, I don't know how it is here in New Zealand, but even in New York, the reason why we got the funding from the city of New York to open that pop-up store was because the city of New York said there's not one store in New York City that sells our local emerging designers. So I think what we need to find is having as many direct channels of sale. But then that being said, for example, online, I think there are certain things that are bought better online than offline. For example, jewelry, where sizing is quite standardized. And every time I walk into a store and I look at jewelry, jewelry is always behind some sort of in a vitrine. And when it is given to you, it is given to you for 14 seconds with two sharp eyes, and it feels uncomfortable. And if you buy jewelry online, you could spend an hour twisting and turning that tool, and then you finally click, and you do this at 3 a.m. with a glass of wine in your hand. So it sounds better to me.
Regarding what you said earlier about the fashion week, the future of fashion week, and the idea of the experience. For example, you mentioned not going to the restaurant anymore because it's not interesting, and linking it to the future of the fashion houses, where there is comparing it to press, where there is like limited edition books, very precious, artistic, or just online, like cheap, available everywhere. Do you see, for example, Gucci or Chanel, since they are really powerful global brands, just going for high street? And for example, having the fashion shows, but charging people to go to the fashion show, like a concert.
I mean, if you look at what Chanel and Louis Vuitton and also Burberry started doing, is they stopped having their fashion shows in the sort of 4 fashion capitals, and they just realized, hold on, we're spending so much money in creating this fashion show. If we just add another $100,000 on top of that, we can just relocate that show. And then we invite the people that we want, and we fly them in, and that's why Louis Vuitton just did the show in Palm Springs, I think. Saint Laurent did it in Los Angeles. Chanel did it in Salzburg. I don't know where they're doing it this year, but so that's a different concept. But I think what it does, it shows you as well that for them this is a pure marketing exercise and nothing else. And unfortunately, young designers can't afford to do this marketing exercise. And then about being inclusive, of course, I mean, Burberry just did the show in London, and they said you can buy certain pieces from that collection straight away online. So they were in some way including the mass market. The problem of the whole thing is just that this doesn't solve the big supply chain problem that they have. Because in some way, you still need the feedback, and these big brands rely on big department stores buying from them. So in some way, the buyer needs to make a decision, and I don't know if you've ever been in one of those showrooms, but buying is a really complicated task where a department store flies to the showroom of Burberry, say, and they go through every jacket and say, can you please make that jacket in a different fabric, because that fabric won't work in our store. So it's almost like a sort of collaboration where the people who sell your garments tell the designer what is needed, and that's what I was mentioning before. That kills creativity, because in some way, you are being told what you should design. There is no solution for that at the moment. The only one who has a solution is Inditex at the moment, or Zara, and they're fantastically smart in what they do. They're fast. They produce everything themselves. They produce so much locally as well. And we did a project with them, and I'm not praising them, but at the same time, I went there with loaded guns, but even in terms of sustainability, I mean, they're just at the level that not even, the luxury houses are. So, it's hard to compete with that model.
Yeah, it's really a fantastic direction that for all these big luxury conglomerates, since Zara worked so well, they did the job so well, and actually they were like some of the first to introduce the fast fashion of these 13 collections a year, and luxury actually seems like it's following that model because it generates a lot of revenue.
I mean, I don't want to be pessimistic, but I think we'll see a few brands closing down soon, because they're not responding. They're just sitting in this bubble, and they're not understanding that luxury has moved on. Luxury as a definition, perhaps in the 90s it was all about big brands and labels and logos, and now we're in an age where people perhaps don't know what luxury is. But Susie Menkes says luxury is everything that you can repair. That automatically just shows you that nothing that the luxury brands sell at the moment, can't be repaired. It's just consumption. So also these big brands are spending so much money on marketing. Is this really necessary? And the business models at the moment are flawed in some way. So we'll see. If you look at the growth in China, most of these brands have grown so much in the last couple of years because they've kept on expanding in the Middle East and in Asia, but now that's done, you know, and I think, yeah, I don't want to be in their position at the moment.
Got one more question. Yep.
I actually just wanted to ask about another definition around emerging and the term emerging designers, and you talk about youth a lot, and there's a lot of emerging designers out there that are not in that youth bracket. So do not just a label also support people of an age who perhaps are emerging?
Yeah.
Or is there an age that you're
So we don't check you. I don't even know if we ask for
You're
your
not
date
ageist.
of birth. No. And I think the definition emerging, for example, our tagline, you can't see it now, but is, you know, we call them the pioneers, so independent designers. It has nothing to do with age. And also, I think the threshold for us in terms of when does a designer stop being emerging or young or independent is when we are not able to talk to the designer anymore. So it becomes a company where we have to talk to a marketing officer or someone else.
Okay.
And I think that's the limit for us. But for example, with designers in London, you know, they can be almost global superstars. And you probably heard from Emilia before, you know, it's still a small operation in London, but then you can go to India and our designers have already 12 stores and 30 employees. So it really depends in which market you're in. Our designers in Berlin, you know, with the amount of, with the same turnover in London, they can afford to have a studio, an apartment, and a shop. In London, they live and work out of a shoebox. Yeah. So it's hard to, in some way, define that. But for us, it's really about designers being independent, and it's not about the age. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Well, that was awesome.
Awesome. Thank you, Stefan.
Thank you.
I think we're going to see lots of changes, and there's been a lot of talk about, you know, what's happening. I mean, there's been, you know, these young designers or emerging designers who are doing, you know, crowdfunding. They put, you know, a prototype up on the web, and when enough people, you know, say they want to pre-order that, you know, then they put it into manufacture. So I mean, there's a lot of different models out there, and I think it's kind of an interesting time, isn't it, in fashion? And I think that people who are in fashion retail, it's pretty hard at the moment to work out, you know, what's the model that's going to be sustainable in the long term. And I love that last question, and one of the things that I hope you're all coming to the railway show. We've got a special capsule of what we're calling, I think, breakthrough designers. And some of those, they're past emerging, they're not established, and there's about 3 designers that we're helping to support to get their profile up. And I think the great thing about IDEA has always been about supporting people, you know, especially who are Dunedin based, who have some connection to Dunedin, because at the end of the day, if our designers can't sell their fashion, you know, they're not there for the long term, and that's what we want to happen, is that, you know, we can support that for the future. So I mean, it's great to hear those comments, and it's lovely to have you here, Carolyn, to interview you. So thank you for coming here, thank you for coming to Dunedin, and thank you as well, and hopefully we'll see you all at the shows tonight or over the next couple of days. So thank you.
Kia ora.